So very proud of this bill, and I'm very proud now to commend it to the House for its first reading.
The question is that the motion be agreed to.
Mr Speaker.
I call the honourable member Ian Lees-Galloway.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. Let me say at the outset that Labour wholeheartedly supports this legislation, and we look forward to the Select Committee process and hearing what people have to say about the bill. There are two aspects of it which I think are particularly worthy of praise. The first, and this is the thing that many parents around New Zealand will be very pleased to see, it does provide a mechanism to get some of these substances that have been untested, that are unproven, off the shelf until such time that they are proven to be safe. I know that there will be people, particularly parents around the country, rejoicing at the knowledge that this legislation is finally being passed and that will be the effect. The second aspect, though, that I think is particularly praiseworthy is the fact that for the first time in this Parliament we are expecting to pass legislation that proposes a mechanism by which some drugs can become legal and make it to market in a regulated, and I hope very tightly regulated, market. That, I believe, sir, is a very positive step in our drug laws. Sorry, say that again, Mike Sabin? So I think this is a very positive step that we may want to look more widely at how it could be applied to other substances. But I know that is not the purpose of this legislation. That is not the debate that we are having today. We need to focus today on the issue at hand, and that is the issue of novel, particularly synthetic psychoactive substances that are not covered by other pieces of legislation. So things like alcohol, tobacco, those convention drugs that are covered by the Misuse of Drugs Act, natural remedies, those sorts of things are not going to be covered by this. This is particularly aimed at things like synthetic cannabis and party pills that we know have, unfortunately, caused a lot of damage to young people because there has been no mechanism by which they can be proven safe before they go to the market. Mr Speaker, I would like to point out some aspects of the bill that I think are particularly excellent. The first is that possession of a substance that is not an approved substance will not attract a criminal conviction. There is no danger of a person being imprisoned. In fact, it will be nothing more than an infringement that attracts a fine of up to $500. I think that, again, is a positive step and one that we might want to reflect on in the future for how that type of arrangement might apply to other substances. Obviously, this allows only for these substances to be sold to people who are aged 18 and over, and that will need to be tightly enforced. Finally, it is an offence to employ someone under 18 to sell psychoactive substances. Again, this is an issue which we have seen time and time again in the tobacco debate, that youngsters, very young people, employed in smaller retail outlets, to be fair, have been in the position where they have been selling a substance which is restricted and ought only to be sold to people who are aged 18 and over. And there is anecdotal evidence of those very young people being bullied, really, into selling tobacco to people who are aged under 18. It would be the same situation with psychoactive substances. And I'm very pleased to see that provision included in this legislation. As the Minister said, around 18 months ago, he introduced the time-limited bans on certain psychoactive substances. Again, we in the opposition supported that. As the Minister said, he has issued notices regarding 37 of those substances. However, many more are still available, and if anything, the pace at which new substances came onto the market to replace those which had their temporary ban applied to them increased after the introduction of those temporary bans. It was never going to be the lasting solution. The Minister freely conceded that. it is fantastic that we have finally, 2 years after the Law Commission tabled its report, Controlling and Regulating Drugs, finally got to the stage where we are debating the lasting legislation that will deal with that situation. Mr. Speaker, there are a range of aspects of the bill that we in the opposition are looking forward to hearing what submitters have to say and looking forward to discussing at the Select Committee. Issues such as plain packaging of psychoactive substances, whether or not the display of psychoactive substances at the point of sale ought to be banned, and whether or not there should be in-store advertising of psychoactive substances, are left in this bill to regulation. They are not dealt with in the primary legislation. Therefore, it is over to a minister to decree by order in council whether or not we have such measures. I know that there are some people out there who think that is not robust enough and that those aspects should be included in the primary legislation. I, for one, am keen to hear the debate for and against that. I want to hear what the officials think is the best approach, but I do believe that those aspects need to be considered closely. There is a transitional period accounted for in this legislation that would mean that some substances which are currently available, to which temporary bans have not been applied, would be potentially possible to carry on selling those substances after this legislation is passed. I do not believe that everybody in our communities thinks that is adequate. Many, many people will be expecting that by passing this legislation, we will be removing all of those substances from the shelf until they are proven safe. We need to look closely at that transitional period. This legislation requires people to acquire a licence to import and a licence to manufacture psychoactive substances. It does not require retailers to acquire a licence to sell psychoactive substances. Now we have a situation in New Zealand at the moment where we have a substance, tobacco, that retailers do not require a licence for in order to sell. We have another substance, alcohol, that retailers do require a licence to sell. Where do psychoactive substances fit in that spectrum? Ought we be leaning more towards a licensing regime, or ought we, as this legislation allows for, not have such a licensing regime for retailers? That is another question that needs to be explored thoroughly at the Select Committee. Although this legislation does adhere very closely to Chapter 5 and the recommendations held in Chapter 5 of the Law Commission's report, one of the recommendations in that chapter was for price controls to be considered as a method of harm reduction regarding psychoactive substances. The Law Commission stated that just as it found with alcohol, it believed that price controls would be a method that we could use to reduce the harm. However, this legislation makes no reference at all to price controls, whether they be through a minimum pricing regime or through the use of excise taxes. Again, another issue that needs to be explored at Select Committee. Mr. Speaker, in the short time I have left, I do just wish to state that although this legislation is a positive move, it is by no means the fulsome consideration of the Misuse of Drugs Act that is required. The Law Commission said that the Misuse of Drugs Act is outdated, it is not fit for purpose, needs to be thoroughly reviewed and replaced. This is far from a replacement for the Misuse of Drugs Act. Other issues canvassed in the Law Commission report, such as the classification system for convention drugs, one that actually considers the real harms associated with different drugs, regulation regarding personal use and possession of drugs, as well as the possession of utensils for drug use, regulation affecting offences and penalties and exemptions from prohibition, all factors that the Law Commission made sound recommendations on, all ignored by this legislation. Mr. Speaker, it is time for a comprehensive review and a comprehensive replacement of the Misuse of Drugs Act. But on the issue of psychoactive substances, getting them off our shelves until they are proven safe, this legislation is good and the Labor Party is pleased to support it.
I call the honourable member, Dr. Paul Hutchison.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, for the opportunity.